Okay, let's go ahead and get underway. Welcome. Thanks for joining us. My name is Robert. I'll be your host. This program is about the great French artist Élisabeth Vigée Le Brun. So this is our art and film history live stream program. Let's go ahead and get underway. We always welcome people to introduce themselves. So in the Zoom chat or the Q&A, you can let us know your first name, where you're connecting from, and who's your favorite artist or what's your favorite type of art. This will help us figure out what programs we're going to do in the future. I'll give you a second or two to answer that. And if you're watching us live on Zoom, we don't do a Zoom demonstration for these programs. So just very quickly, there's usually only a couple things that people ever have questions or concerns on. One is the sound and the other is the screen or video display. So everyone will be in listen only mode or muted. So if you start cheering during our program, unfortunately, no one will be able to hear you. If you do want to raise or lower the volume on your session, you can check the settings locally on your own device. When we go to start watching the film, if you're watching us live on Zoom, it may be helpful if you have a speaker or earbuds or headphones or something like that. Might not be needed, but might be helpful if you have it. If you want to adjust the screen display so that the slides and the videos that we're showing take up the full screen, if they're not currently taking up the full screen because there's these black boxes that have my name, Robert Kellerman, in them, you can make those go away at your end by clicking on View or View Options, which is usually at the top of a person's device, and you can check off the side-by-side mode. Throughout our program, if you're watching us again on Zoom or Facebook Live, we always love to hear from everyone. One of our favorite parts of doing these programs is hearing what your thoughts and opinions are. So if you have any questions or comments, type those in the chat or the Q&A in Zoom or the comment section on Facebook. For those of you not familiar with us, we're Washington, D.C. History and Culture. We're a nonprofit community organization, and we give people the opportunity to experience not only the history and culture of Washington, D.C., but other places in the world. So today we're going to be venturing off to Europe. I'll be your host. My name is Robert Kellerman, and I'm the founder and director of the Washington, D.C. History and Culture Organization. So here in Washington, D.C., there's a really fabulous museum. It's called the National Museum of Women in the Arts. And one of the things that they do that I like is they have this hashtag, name 5 women artists. They're very concerned that people out there can't name 5 women artists. So most people have heard of Frida Kahlo and Georgia O'Keeffe, Mary Cassatt. Some people heard of the great photographer Annie Leibovitz. So I thought I would help add one to your list, not just her name, but show you some of her art. And then we'll watch a film and learn about her amazing life. And that's Élisabeth Vigée Le Brun. She was a French artist born in 1755. And here's a great quote from the National Gallery in London for an exhibit they had about her life. She said, at 15, she was painting the aristocracy. In her 20s, she was the favored painter of Marie Antoinette. And by her 30s, she was fleeing the French Revolution. And so that is Élisabeth Vigée Le Brun in one sentence. And she's a very well-traveled person. Now, this may not seem like that big of a deal now in 2021 for someone to be traveling all over Europe, but for someone of her era, particularly a woman, this would have been very unusual. And we'll see some of these places that she visited: Rome, Venice, St. Petersburg, Moscow, London, etc., etc. So not just staying in France. And so what we're going to do is, if you're watching this live, I'm going to give like a quick overview of Elisabeth's life so you can get kind of a historical context of her and her career and her artwork. And then I'm going to go ahead and stream the film. If you're watching this, a recording of this, you can just watch this kind of overview program and then find the film on your own. So let's talk about Élisabeth Vigée Le Brun. And again, we'll do like a quick overview of her life for historical context, and then we'll stream the film if you're watching the live version. So she wrote an autobiography, and if you want to learn more about a person, it's always helpful if you can read their autobiography. And you can actually find this, it's on the public domain. You can buy it on sites like Amazon. You can also download it on different websites. So if you just want to look this up on your own, you can Google it. This is the very first sentence of her autobiography. She says, "I will begin by speaking of my childhood, which is the symbol, so to say, of my whole life, since my love for painting declared itself at my earliest youth." And Elizabeth lived in an era before photography. So when Elizabeth was alive, if you wanted your portrait done, you couldn't take a photograph because that had not been invented yet. The only way you could get a likeness or a rendering of yourself or someone you loved was to hire an artist and have that person do a portrait of you. So this has obviously been a art form that's been popular for centuries. And this particular time in France, when someone got their portrait done, it was a really big deal. It was usually a expensive process to have completed. So it was usually only done by the very wealthy and the aristocracy. And this is the era that Elizabeth is living in. What happens with her is she starts creating art at a very young age. Her father was an artist and he greatly encouraged her. And she has kind of like a, for lack of a better term, a coming out party in Paris when she makes this self-portrait of herself in 1782. And this got a huge amount of attention throughout the French art world, particularly in Paris. You could kind of say that it went viral in 1782 standards, partially just because, number one, the portrait is such fine quality. Elizabeth never really had very much formal art training. So really incredible that she could create something like this on her own. So a magnificent portrait. Also, in addition, this is a self-portrait. So this is a depiction of her, and she was very beautiful. So her beauty and her talent and it captivated Parisian society. And so again, this is kind of her coming out party, so to speak. And what I wanted to do before we actually watch the film is show you some of her artwork and just give you, again, some of the like historical context behind it, because some of these paintings, they flash up pretty quickly on the film and you might not be sure what exactly you're looking at. But again, this is her self-portrait from 1782. Again, she really just kind of came out of nowhere and burst onto the scene. Again, this is the era for photography. So really incredibly detailed. One of the kind of goals of painting at this point in time was to make portraits that were as lifelike as possible. And you can see she did an amazing and incredible job on this portrait of herself. So after this portrait comes out, a lot of other people that are wealthy and aristocratic say, "Hey, I'd like her to do my portrait as well." And so that's what ends up happening. So that was really kind of her calling card into the French aristocracy. And so I'll give you some examples of some other portraits that she did. This is the famous Madame du Barry, who you may have heard about or seen in films. This is at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., one of our hometown art museums. This is the bottom section of the painting, just to give you kind of a close-up. And again, really incredible detail on this in terms of the fabric and the flesh tones and the flowers. So if you were living back in this era, wouldn't you want to have a portrait like this of yourself, all dressed up in your fanciest clothes? And then here are some other examples that she did early on in her career. This one is at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. This one is at the Louvre. If you were joined us for our Louvre program we had a few weeks ago, we saw this one. This is an Italian actress. She's wearing a muff to keep her hands warm. Sometimes she would also do portraits of men. She usually did portraits of women, but sometimes she would do portraits of men as well. This one is also at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. These two paintings that I've shown you that the National Gallery of Art in D.C. are in the same gallery that the big giant Napoleon portrait is at. Élisabeth Vigée Le Brun did not do the Napoleon portrait, but if you know where that is in the museum, her works are in the same spot. Here is another great portrait from the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And she periodically do portraits of children. This one's at the National Gallery for our friend joining us from London. Here is another one from London, the Wallace collection. And this one has always captivated me. This one is also at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. She's wearing a headdress. And again, when you look at these portraits, you can tell these are people that are very affluent and wealthy. They are able to afford these nice clothes and be able to afford to hire an artist to do their portrait. And Élisabeth Vigée Le Brun, because she was so talented and so in demand, she obtained really high fees or commissions for her portraits. She was not just doing portraits of regular everyday people. But when you see this painting, in particular in Washington, D.C., just really captivating. Looks like she's going to start talking to you at any moment now. And so what happens is, because Elisabeth is so talented and because she's getting so much acclaim for her portraits, she comes to the attention of Queen Marie Antoinette of France. And Elisabeth talks about kind of just running into her one day in a park. She says from her autobiography, "One morning I met Queen Marie Antoinette walking in the park with several of the ladies of her court. They were all in white dresses and so young and pretty that for a moment I thought I was in a dream." And so Marie Antoinette hears about Elisabeth's portraits and sees some of them and says, "Oh, I'd like to hire her to do some work for me." And so she ends up actually doing quite a few portraits for her. Here are a few other quotes from her autobiography. In one instance, she says, "I painted various pictures of the queen at different times." So she did numerous portraits of Marie Antoinette. And she got along really well with her. One of the keys of her success is not only was she very talented, but she was also very personable, and she was very charming and engaging and intelligent. She was able to talk about a wide variety of topics with people and interact with them. And she says, "I was so fortunate as to be on very pleasant terms with the queen." So she's kind of like the queen's buddy, so to speak. And so she ends up getting a lot of commissions from her. Here are some examples, some of the work that she did. This is probably the most famous portrait that she did of Marie Antoinette. This one, there's actually a few different versions of this painting. So this is the one that's at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, and there's almost an identical copy at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. This portrait was scandalous when it came out. I'll let the film explain why. Basically, it was because her dress is considered very casual. This was the type of attire that a woman would wear indoors and not out in public. So it was kind of surprising to people to see her in such an informal dress. But that being said, it did kind of make this type of clothing popular with the masses, so to speak, and not just for indoors. Here is another well-known portrait, Marie Antoinette with a rose. And I'm guessing that if you're in Europe, particularly in France, it's probably very likely that you've heard of Élisabeth Vigée Le Brun. I'm guessing if you're in the United States, you may not have. She's not as very well known here in the US, which is one reason why I wanted to do this program. You may have heard of her in the past month if you attended our program that we did about the Louvre, but you really don't hear as much about her as you should, especially because she's so talented. And not only is she an incredible artist, but just really had a fascinating life, which we'll talk more about when the film comes up. So Marie Antoinette. This painting hangs in the Palace of Versailles. This one's in a private collection. And this one is also at Versailles. So this is an interesting portrait. After a while, the king and the queen were receiving a huge amount of criticism, and they were not popular by a large swath of the French population. And so Elizabeth makes this painting to kind of help change the image of the queen. She's depicting Marie Antoinette as a mother. There's her three children. One of the queen's children had died, and that's portrayed basically by this empty space here. And then here's her other three children. But this is Elizabeth's attempts to kind of help rehabilitate the image of the queen, so to speak. And so you have painting kind of influencing history and influencing culture and trying to persuade people, which is always kind of a fascinating angle that people take even today. It's a very nice portrait. However, unfortunately, as nice as the portrait is and as talented as Elizabeth was, it did not really help sway the public's opinion of the queen, unfortunately for her. And so the French Revolution ends up taking place, where the masses decide to overthrow the French monarchy. So this is an important event in world history, obviously very important in France. And what ends up happening is the hordes of masses end up storming the residence where the king and queen are staying. They confront the two of them. They're put under arrest. It's kind of a long story how it ends up happening. It doesn't take place overnight. It drags out over many, many months. But eventually, the king and queen are sent to the guillotine, and they're both beheaded along with many other people of the aristocracy. And so when that happens, because all these murders are going around taking place, Elizabeth, who was in cahoots, so to speak, with the queen, is fearful for her life. And if she had stayed in France, it's very likely that she would have been killed herself. So she ends up fleeing for a period of about 12 years and 3 months. She ends up going to places like Italy and Russia, among others. And these are some of the portraits she did during this particular time. So she basically just grabs some of her stuff and some money to live off of. She packs up and goes to Italy, and she resumes her painting career, doing portraits of the wealthy and the aristocracy. She had always wanted to visit Italy because it was kind of like a pilgrimage site for artists of that era to go there and see all the old masters. So that's what she does. And then while she's there, she's also doing some portraits to pay the bills. This is at the Hermitage Museum in Russia. Russia and France have a long, interesting history between the two of them. And so eventually she ends up going to Russia and doing a number of portraits there. And again, just a quick overview of some of her paintings, just so you can get a see of what they look like. Because in the film, I love the docudrama I'm about to show about her life, but they flashed the artwork up pretty quickly. So just to give you a chance to see some of the artwork. Again, she just didn't do portraits of women, although women were her main clientele. Interesting when she takes a portrait of a woman and kind of does a different approach with it, like this one. The princess is floating through the air. You can find her paintings all over the world. This is a nice one that's at the University of Arizona Museum of Art. Another one at the Hermitage. And again, it's just really surprising to me that in the United States, where I live, people are not more familiar with her artwork, because number one, again, she's so talented. And then number two, just had this really fascinating life. So really kind of disappointing that more people haven't heard about her, but perhaps after today's program, people will be more familiar with her. This one's at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. This is at the Dallas Museum of Art. And again, you can find her paintings all over the world, mostly in the United States and Europe, of course. It's at the Walker Art Gallery in Liverpool. Okay, let's talk about her daughter, Julie. So some of Elizabeth's most well-known portraits are of her and or her daughter. Here's a great example. This is at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. Elizabeth did not invent this idea of painting someone as they look into a mirror, but gosh, she sure did a great job depicting her daughter. It's also really cool that not only is this a great portrait of her daughter, but the angle of the mirror, the portrait in the mirror, the reflection is not the angle that we would see if we were actually looking at this. But she takes a little bit of artistic liberties, which I don't think anyone has any problems with. And we actually get to see the reflection of her daughter. But if this was actually a real life pose, this would not be the reflection that we would be seeing in the mirror, because she's looking straight down and she's holding the mirror to angle. But that being said, it's really an incredible portrait. A number of artists have done this idea or concept over the course of history, but I don't know of anyone that did it as well as she did. This one's at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, and just really great job on this painting. These are two other well-known portraits that Elizabeth did of herself with her daughter. So these are self-portraits with Julie. This one is also at the Louvre. This one is before the French Revolution, and she's dressed in nice clothes. She's wearing the headpiece, whatnot. She doesn't look like a queen or anything like that, but she looks very part of the aristocracy. It's from 1786, before the French Revolution. Elizabeth's daughter would also grow up to be an artist in her own right, although not nearly as successful as her mom. Elizabeth was married. Her and her husband end up getting divorced. They'll talk about that in the film. Divorce would have not been that common during this era, so also kind of unusual network. And this portrait was done after the French Revolution. And in this one, you can see the comparison and contrast. Elizabeth dressed more like a regular person, not part of the aristocracy. So you can see the kind of the contrast between this one, where she's depicting herself as part of the wealthy class, and this one where she's just basically wearing kind of regular everyday clothes, kind of connecting herself with the masses, so to speak. And another great portrait. Oh, let me go back. I forgot to mention this one at the Louvre. And then again, just another great portrait of the two of them. It's really neat how her daughter's eye is right up against her cheek. That's very touching, but a great mother-daughter portrait. Patty brought up a good point in the chat. She said the inaccurate angle of the previous portrait with the mirror actually demands the viewer look more intently at the painting. That's a great point, Patty. Thanks for including that. I greatly appreciate that. Again, one of our favorite parts of these programs is hearing what all of you think. So appreciate that. Now, unfortunately, Elizabeth and her daughter Julie have a falling out later in life. Julie ends up getting married. Elizabeth did not agree with her choice of husbands. That causes a bunch of family problems. And they're not on speaking terms for a long time, and they're actually separated and kind of go their own ways for quite a while. Again, the film talks more about what happens to her daughter, so I'll let them take care of that. Here is a self-portrait that Elizabeth did later in life at the Hermitage. And it's nice that she frequently includes her painting apparatus in her artworks. It's not so much a big deal now, but if you look at paintings or portraits of really any type, even photographs that people before, say, I don't know, the 1900s or the mid 1900s, you frequently see people giving kind of clues to what they do for their profession. I'm guessing if someone was to look at, say, your Facebook photo or your LinkedIn photo, they wouldn't really be able to tell what you do for a living, most likely. But back in the day, it was really common for people to have their portrait done with whatever they did for a living. Either they were a baker or a tool and die maker or whatever. And so she's depicting herself as an artist because that's, of course, what she is. Okay, we're getting close to the end of our program. Just a few more final things. This is the very last sentence of Elizabeth's autobiography. Again, you can find this on the public domain. You can also buy it on places like Amazon. She says, the very last sentence of her autobiography, I hope to end peacefully, a wandering and even laborious but honest life. So I can say that she accomplished all three of those things. She definitely was wandering around Europe. I don't know if I'd call it wandering, but she was definitely traveling all over Europe. And yeah, she did lead a very laborious life. She worked extremely hard. She painted over 600 portraits, did a few other types of paintings like landscapes and whatnot. And as far as the honest life, yeah, she's pretty highly regarded throughout the world. She has a pretty simple grave site. She's buried in a cemetery outside of Paris. And just, this is nice, but not maybe as elaborate as you might think for such a well-known artist. You gotta love the French. They incorporate artwork in so many different aspects of their culture, whether it's currency, stamps, food, et cetera, et cetera. So if you're going to be in France mailing some letters, you can use the Élisabeth Vigée Le Brun stamps. And again, Élisabeth Vigée Le Brun, born 1755, died in 1842. At 15, she was painting the aristocracy. In her 20s, she was the favored painter of Marie Antoinette. And by her 30s, she was fleeing the French Revolution. Just as a reminder, Washington, D.C. History and Culture, we're a nonprofit community organization. We have other art programs that are kind of like this that you can find recordings of on our YouTube page. Some of the recent ones we've done are one on the National Gallery of Art, the American Art Collection up to 1815. A few weeks ago, we recorded our program Manet and Impressionism at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. We don't record, we're not able to, or we don't record every single live stream program we do. There's kind of a million things that factor into whether or not we're able to record them. But these are some examples of some of the ones we did. And then last spring, we had a program kind of like this, where we analyzed and then streamed the film Renoir. So if you like art films or films about artists, really recommend checking this one out. And again, the analysis that I did on it is on our YouTube page, which you can find out. The name of our YouTube page is Washington, D.C. History and Culture. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to go ahead and stream the film now. It's about an hour and 45 or hour and 50 minutes. So I'm going to stream it if you're watching this live on Zoom. If you're watching a recording of this at some point in time in the future, you can pull up the film on a variety of different places. You can also buy the DVD. So if you're watching the recording of this, the programs would be coming to a conclusion very quickly. If you're watching on Facebook Live, again, kind of the same thing. Well, I'm going to have to disconnect because I can't stream the film over Facebook Live because of copyright issues. I can stream it over Zoom, but not Facebook Live. So if you're watching us through that, there's a lot of different places that you can find the film. So just like Google it or whatnot. Or again, you can also purchase the DVD of it. Let's see. When we do these live stream programs, usually no one has issues with the image or the audio. Sometimes people have issues with the video. But again, if you're watching a recording of this, you'll have to pull up the film on your own. If you are not, then just sit tight and we'll get you squared away in just 1 second.